Hey everybody, Jason here. So the last time we worked on the kayak, we did our final coats of epoxy, and since then we've allowed it to get a nice hard cure. So today we're going to sand the hull, and then later on we're going to do our varnishing. So to get started, we're going to sand the hull, and I'm going to start with 150 grit paper on the orbital sander, and then I'm going to move to 220 grit, and then I'll finish it all off with a little bit of hand sanding. Let's get started. So this stage of the finishing process is going to take 2 days. We're going to allow ourselves a good full day of sanding, and then because of the dust we're going to create, we're going to let the dust settle overnight and then clean up and come back the next day to do the varnishing. The final sanding really is the stage that'll make the difference between an average finish and an award winner. Our goal today is to provide a smooth, ripple-free surface for the varnish. We'll know when we have it right when the entire surface of the hull turns a uniform cloudy gray. Now you can do this final sanding entirely by hand. I'm going to use an orbital sander. Now if you use an orbital sander, it's really important that you keep the sander moving and the surface of the sander flat on the surface of the kayak and move it over a large area. We're not going to use the orbital sander at the edges or the chines. Those areas we're going to sand by hand to ensure we get the best finish. Just like before when we laid up the panels, it's incredibly easy to sand through the chines of the boat. So this is another reason why we're going to hand sand those areas. We definitely don't want to cut through any of the glass on any of our edges. As we work, it's important that we change the sandpaper as often as the paper gets dull. When the sandpaper gets dull, it builds up some heat and then softens the epoxy and it fills the paper more quickly. Really at this stage, all the major bumps should be gone because we've removed all the major bumps when we were doing our final epoxy coats. Okay, so I finished off sanding the hull of the kayak. Now I just have to make sure to sand the hatches before I finish up for the day. Then I'll just let the dust settle overnight so that I can dust everything off, clean it up for the varnishing. If I dust everything off now, I'll have airborne dust that's still up in the air that could float down and I'll have to remove it later, or if I rushed and did the varnishing, would contaminate my varnish. So it's best that I just get all my sanding done now, come back tomorrow, dust everything off, and then be ready for varnishing. Okay, so I've let the dust settle overnight, and now I'm just going to clean everything up. I'm going to clean my areas. I'm going to sweep the floor, I'm going to mop the floor, just clean up anything that's dusty around the kayak so that I can try to ensure that none of that dust gets into my finish. Once I've cleaned everything up, I'm actually going to wait, about 20 minutes, half an hour, just in case I've stirred things up and put more dust in the air, let it settle, look everything over, and then get to it. Okay, so I've cleaned up the shop and around the kayak, dusted everything off, and I've also taken some brush thinner, the same brand that I'm using of my varnish, put it on a damp cloth and just gone over the hull to remove any dust that didn't brush off. So I've got a pretty good uncontaminated hull to start with, and to me that's one of the most important steps. So there's a lot of different ways to varnish a boat. I'm going to do it my way. I've heard of people attaching straps to within the hatches and the cockpit area and suspending the boat and doing it all in one go. Some people varnish the deck first. Some people flip it over and do the bottom of the hull first. Like I said, I'm going to do it my way. And to me, when I think about all the different ways that people varnish a hull, it actually goes to show that it's not as complex and worrisome as some people may think it is, okay? We do it in different ways and we still end up with a good result. There's a couple tricks that I think are important, and they seem to be pretty standard regardless of how you do it. And the first thing is, whenever possible, try to apply your varnish from dry onto wet. Okay, so what I mean is, as you're working, you'll have some of your hull with varnish on it, and you'll go to add more varnish. Don't apply your next coat from the wet surface onto the dry. Instead, go from the dry towards what you've already varnished, okay? And the reason is, if you go from the wet to the dry, then when you make contact with the hull, you're gonna create a mark or a high spot. And it's also more likely that you'll get a run in that area. So if you work from the dry onto the wet, you'll avoid that situation, okay? The other thing that I highly recommend is, regardless of whether you're gonna use a foam roller or a sponge brush, I recommend that you do have a sponge brush handy to just tip off any of the runs or high spots as you go, okay? So I'm gonna be using both. I'm gonna start off with a roller, and then I'm also gonna have the sponge brush handy, and I'll use it for different areas, like around the cockpit combing. So just like other parts of the building process, I'm gonna work from one end of the boat towards the other end, and I'm gonna focus applying the varnish to about a foot or a 2 foot area, and then continue. So I'll just work in 2 foot patches and work my way down the boat. Okay, so I'm gonna be applying the varnish to the deck first, and I'm gonna also bring the varnish down to the first chine, or midway to the bottom of the hull. Now the reason why I'm doing this is that if I do miss any runs, or there's any like run imperfections, it's gonna be deep down below the water surface, and later on when I'm in the boat, not be noticeable. So that's the first coat of varnish. Now, I'm gonna let that sit. It's gonna take about 24 hours to completely dry. And then I'm gonna do a wet sand with 400 grit wet sandpaper. Now, to get that really nice glossy protective finish, I'm gonna do 5 coats of varnish. So what that means is every day I'm gonna come out and I'm gonna do a wet sand, clean off the hull, and then do another coat of varnish. Then let it dry for 24 hours and then repeat with a wet sand, coat of varnish, and let it dry. All right, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll start trimming it out.